Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history.
Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm very glad of being today with Rowan Dorin. Rowan is an associate professor of history here at Stanford, and he's the director of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. It's a long name for the center, so I want to make sure on the emails that we always use the
acronym, right? CMEMS.
Right.
Short, pithy.
So I want to make sure that I was pronouncing it in the right way. So I'm very happy of having you here. You are the author of this book, No Return, Jews, Christian Usurers, and the Spread of Mass Expulsion in Medieval Europe, right? That came out
a year ago.
A year ago. And we're chatting about the book and about your career. So I'm very glad that you accepted to take the time and send it out.
I'm delighted. Thank you for the invitation.
No, thank you. Thank you. Let me ask you first question about you and your career, right? You're Canadian. How did you end up working on the Middle Ages in Europe and teaching about that here in California? What's the story?
I think my family still wonders about that. I still wonder about that. So I was born and raised in Western Canada to a family that was maybe vaguely interested in history, but really nothing before the 20th century, definitely. And my parents were both involved in politics, sort of political organizers. And on my mother's side, I come from a sort of an Irish Catholic family, and we, like many Irish Catholic families, got together for sort of big Irish Catholic family reunions. And my father's family came from sort of Lutheran German immigrants who had left sort of Prussia in the early 20th century. And I was raised thinking that I was going to become an economist, or at least from the time I was a teenager. Like my plan was, my dream job was to be chief economist of the World Bank. And when I was applying to college, this was like the most exciting thing I could possibly imagine doing. I mean, actually, probably still is the most exciting thing I could imagine doing. It just didn't work out that way. And so I ended up going to college. I got into Harvard, and I went to Harvard, and I was going to economics. I did the usual sort of introductory economic sequence. And then I took a distribution requirement on the Renaissance in Florence, because I was like, hey, that sounds fun. It got good ratings. And in that class, we got to go play with medieval manuscripts. And in the economics class, we were just drawing things on the board. And there was a party at the end for the top economics students where it was like hummus and vegetables. And then the professor who had the Renaissance in Florence class had a party where there was champagne and truffles. Little did I realize that this in fact would be reversed. I would have a lot more champagne and truffles in my life if I'd stuck with economics. But at the moment it was like this is so much more glamorous and exciting, and I'm getting all this attention. And so I kept on doing economics for a while, but got more and more interested in economic history. And in fact, the first paper I wrote for that class on the Renaissance in Florence was actually about the usury doctrine in Renaissance Florence and its impact on economic development. And so my very first college history paper, in fact, already foreshadowed what my book would end up being about, even though for a long time I left and I thought that the usury doctrine was in fact the most boring thing one could possibly think about, and I exhausted it, and then I got dragged back into it, and then I wrote a book anyways about that. And so then I ended up taking more medieval economic history classes and other economic history classes, and then I kept on thinking, well, maybe I'll go to law school and then do international tax law. But then I got funding to go get a master's, and then I got funding to do a PhD, and then I got a postdoc, and then I got hired at Stanford, and so everything else is still waiting.
And how did you manage we're going to talk about the details of your archival work for this book, which is quite impressive. But you need a bunch of tools for doing that, right? Reading medieval English and French. these are regular tools that you learn during the PhD in history, or like how do you, I mean, besides the interest on this topic, how do you develop the skills to perform like top research on that?
So you're right that a lot of the work for this book involves reading, first of all, unfamiliar languages. So medieval Latin, various vernaculars, Catalan, Old French, Middle English, Middle High German. There's some early modern Dutch that at one point I was sitting in a very, very small room the size of a closet during my year of research abroad and reading early modern Dutch and wondering like, how did this happen to me? Like where did I go wrong? And you have to do that, moreover, in sort of handwritten manuscripts and scripts that are sometimes truly terrible. And sometimes they're nice and sometimes they're awful. And it's definitely a learning process. To give one sense of the learning of the long journey that I was on, my very first time going into the archives was to the Venetian State Archives, and I was still an undergraduate, and I was preparing for my honors thesis. And I had found that there were sort of two documents that had never been published from the early 13th century that seemed related to the topic I was working on at the time, regional trade systems in the Mediterranean. I was very interested in how regional trade sort of was engaged with and interconnected with local systems and then international trade networks. And so there's these two documents. And so I eventually got into the archives. I didn't speak Italian at the time. I had to speak Latin with the archivist because that was the only shared language we had. And fortunately, I had been doing some Latin in college. And I looked at these two documents and they brought them out to me, and I couldn't read anything. Like, it was just chicken scratch. And I'd been warned that I might cry when I got to the archives. And I didn't cry in the archives, but I may have been prepared to give my academic career. And so I thought, well, okay, I will bring them to my advisor. So I got images of them, and I showed up with images to my advisor. And I was about to start moaning how terrible this is. And I showed them to her, and she's like, oh, aren't you lucky? These are so marvelously clear. And I thought, okay, clearly this is a case where I just need to do more of this, because there clearly is a spectrum in which there is unreadable stuff, but this isn't it. And so I went back and word by word and line by line, I learned to decipher it. And the nice thing about having now flipped through literally thousands of manuscripts and probably tens of thousands of pages of medieval scripts is that your eye starts to get better distinguishing them. But that doesn't mean that every so often I don't get really, really angry that a medieval scribe was like working in haste with really bad ink on like pretty terrible quality parchment and sort of grumbling and swearing internally. But one gets trained in grad school how to do this, but a lot of it is just you go into the archives and you just tear your hair out, and then you figure out one word, and then the next word, and then suddenly the system falls into place.
It always blows my mind whenever I talk to medieval and ancient historians about how they very colloquially talk about developing the skills of speaking and reading this wide range of languages.
But you probably have glorious Python and R skills. I always think about this, right? Depending on our programs, I spend my time learning, useless languages, and people who work on more recent topics, learn really great programming skills. And once in a while, everyone does all of them. But, we all have to spend time mastering our different languages. So that's how I feel a bit better about how bad my sort of status skills are, is that I had to spend time learning other, languages instead.
Totally. And let me ask you one more question about your path before getting into the book, been related to that. So you came from economics into history, and you still do what I would argue is economic history, and you have that general interest. How do you perceive this type of questions and, not necessarily approaches, but concerns about the material and market dimensions of the past and history in general, and particularly in medieval European history? Is there a tiny community of people that get together? Do you have to cross the street and go to come to poli sci for having some attention? How do you deal with that?
So, 30, 40 years ago, there was a very robust community of scholars working on, let's say, medieval social and economic history, and the two things were very connected. And then most of that has faded away as other topics and themes have risen to the fore, to the point that when I was applying for a fellowship to go spend time in Paris with a very eminent scholar of medieval economic life, he was just shocked that anybody coming out of an American program in history was still interested in anything to do with sort of medieval economic life. And so he eagerly sort of welcomed me, sort of was like, they exist, they're alive, there's one of them still there. I think it's been resurging of late in different ways, partly because archaeology, medieval archaeology, has been exploding. And so there's a lot of new work that is emerging in societies and contexts in which we don't have a lot of written evidence, but we're producing a great deal of material data. That has certainly always been true for the ancient world. So a lot of ancient economic history has necessarily been generated based on, potsherds and coin finds and, the materiality of daily life. But medieval archaeology is a much more recent phenomenon. So it's been exciting to see how a new interest in material culture is generating the sorts of evidence that can also answer some classic questions of economic history. And fortunately, in continental Europe and in the UK, there has remained a very vibrant tradition of people interested in economic history and social history. It just means that it's a long flight from California to find other people asking the same questions. But they do exist. It is a robust community. And I hope that the work that I'm doing sort of illuminates to those who might not already think this actually matters of why even questions that they're interested about cultural history. My book obviously concerns migration movements and foreignness and citizenship. It's a book about mass expulsion. Why even people who are interested in those things should care also about some of the economic dynamics that are undergirding or fostering these particular events.
Let me ask you now about that mass expulsions, which it's the main topic of your book. And I mean, the book is super interesting main dimension. One of the things that helps you to reevaluate things that you thought you knew past someone that is not in the field. I guess that probably some of those things are not so controversial or new for someone on the field, but still, they're, I think, challenge some of the big truths that we thought of.
Good. That's what I know. That's why I wrote it. That's why I published it. That's the dream.
And the first one that surprised me was I thought that we knew that mass expulsions were this pretty common type of policy pretty much since antiquity. What you argue is that actually that's not the case. And I'm going to ask you more about this, but it was the policy innovation, right? So the first thing that I want to ask you is, was this actually prevalent in antiquity and then it was interrupted with the entire collapse of Rome and so on? Or it was not even as common back then? What was the broad story there?
Sure. So in the book, I explore what I call sort of collective expulsion. I mean, the title is mass expulsion in the book because collective expulsion is like, what is that? But in international law, for instance, modern international law, you are allowed to deport or banish an individual from your sovereign domain as long as you follow certain kinds of due process. But you aren't allowed under international law to take an entire community of people and just remove them as a community outside your sort of sovereign space. And what's interesting is in the ancient world, we all know if you grew up sort of hearing stories from the Bible, for instance, you hear about the people of Judea being carted off to sort of Assyria or Babylon. Or there's various other sort of Near Eastern sort of accounts, and then also in other parts of the ancient world. But in almost all of these cases, the communities are being removed from their native areas and moved somewhere else within the sovereign sort of jurisdiction of the empire, whatever the polity is. And that, in fact, remains very common among sort of imperial structures down to the 20th century, for the most part, when imperial Russia or imperial China is sort of targeting populations of concern, they don't kick them out of the whole empire, they relocate them to somewhere else. So the idea of taking a given community of people and driving them from the bounds of your political authority completely is really unusual in the ancient world. There's instances where sort of, people might get banished from the city of Rome. They'll banish astrologers or soothsayers or others. But even there, you get banished from the city of Rome, this kind of the sacred area of Rome, the priest things, but you're still in the Roman Empire. Or you get banished from, Italy. But it's not really until the very end of the Roman Empire that we start seeing heretics, for instance, getting expelled, ordered expelled from the boundaries of the empire. And there's clearly something to do with the sacralization of space here. And then the Roman Empire collapses and that dies off. And then it starts to pick up again in the Middle Ages. And all of a sudden you find different groups, heretics, Jews, communities of foreigners, that are being ordered to sort of leave the sovereign space of a particular political organization. And that picks up steam and becomes very, very common by the end of the 12th century into the 13th century, which is part of what my book tries to narrate. And then becomes so persistent after that and spreads around the world that we have come to think of it as being almost sort of embedded in human societies, where in fact it was deeply unusual in most of sort of global history to have that phenomenon. We just are so used to it, especially the 20th century, in which, the 20th century is, a horror stories of just different regimes driving out whole communities from their polities. But that's a relatively unusual development, before the Middle Ages.
And then you described that the innovation here has led to two types, or like two sources of two origins, right? And you talk about the British style, let's say, and the French styles. What are those styles? How are they different, and how independent the two of them are between each other?
So when I started working on this book, I really wanted to write a book about the Mediterranean. And I spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean, in wonderful Mediterranean archives. And then, unfortunately, all the historical evidence pulled me northward into England and France as the places where these particular regimes of collective expulsion really get underway. And one of the things that I think has misled some of the historians who've thought about the topic in the past is that the end result in both England and France ends up looking similar. These are kingdoms that are both expelling Jews. They're both expelling communities of foreigners. And so it's easy to think that this is in fact the same phenomenon, but the actual origins in each kingdom are quite different. So in England, and this is obviously shaped by the insular, like literally sort of island nature of most of the kingdom. Scotland's up there, but England is largely insular. That there's a concern with foreignness and foreigners that emerges in the 12th century, and a desire to kind of purge these. So we find foreign mercenaries being expelled. We then find foreign merchants regularly being expelled in cases of kind of conflict over wool and cloth with Flanders, or political disputes with France. And so, all French merchants must leave the realm, or all Flemish merchants must leave the realm. And if they don't, we will confiscate their property and imprison them and do various nasty things to them. And then eventually to this starts being added threatened expulsions of Jews. But that sort of comes along at a later point. And then alongside sort of the emergent threats towards England's Jewish communities, which we can talk about down the road, we also find kings of England expelling Italian merchant communities on the grounds of usury. And they say, we are going to expel you because you are usurers. In fact, it's because the kings are poor, and because threatening to expel these Italian merchants is a way of squeezing them for money. And so in some cases, the Italian merchants just pay a bribe. In some cases, they actually do leave the realm, and then they get invited back, usually because they paid some sort of, bribe. But in England, it's very much dictated by existing practices. The rise of, let's say, collective expulsion is very much driven by the emergence of practices around foreignness and how you remove communities of foreigners from the realm. In France, it's quite a different story, where there isn't a tradition of driving foreigners from the realm. There, it's very anchored in intellectual concerns emanating out of university cultures in Paris, where there is a great deal of Catholic theological developments that are concerned about pollution, contagion, Catholic purity, sort of how far do sins spread within communities? If one member of the community is sinning, can it spread to others? If one member of a household is sinning, can it spread to others? And this begins to shape the discourse in France, such that we do find lots of rhetoric around purging the realm of heretics, then of prostitutes, and then of various other sort of communities, and then Jews and usurers. But the emergence of that comes out of a really profound concern, intellectual concern with purity and purification, that doesn't really have the same resonance in England, where there's much more of a sense of otherness in almost proto-national terms. But the end result is that in both cases, those communities that come to be associated with money lending, Jews and foreign merchants, get expelled from both realms.
And how do these practices spread beyond these places, right? How does this reach the Mediterranean?
So one of the key things that happens that fortunately brought me back to the Mediterranean, thank goodness, in the end, was that there's a king in France, King Louis, who becomes Saint Louis, who is the Saint Louis that gives name to Saint Louis, the city in Missouri, who's well known because of that. And he also built the Saint Chapelle in Paris, one of those beautiful examples of sort of Gothic architecture in the world. And Saint Louis sort of leads a lot of this charge on the purity side. He loses 2 crusades. Obviously, he failed and he died in the second one. And his atonement efforts partly involve trying to purify the realm and make sure that he is not personally responsible for abetting and protecting sin. And his example gets picked up by the institutionalized Catholic Church. The Pope and a council meeting in Lyon in the late 13th century says, oh, hey, this is interesting what's happening in France. What if we do this for the entirety of sort of Christian faith, all of Latin Christendom? And so they issue a law that says, all foreign usurers must be driven out of wherever they're living within 3 months. And suddenly you have a sort of a piece of church law that is, theoretically binding on all Latin Christians, that makes its way out of the council chambers and, finds its way into sermons and synodal statutes and textbooks and treatises of all sorts, and that is sort of being disseminated through all of the organs and channels that the Catholic Church has at its disposal, trying to shape practice. And we know from eyewitness accounts that it's actually aimed at sort of Christian usurers. The main concern to the Church at this point is to stamp out Christians from engaging in usury, which goes against a lot of the way we tend to talk about money in the Middle Ages and the fact that Jews often had been scapegoats. But the Church's concern is with Christian souls, and their goal is to keep Christians from doing this. So the law says, banish or expel foreign usurers from your domains, and because of the eyewitness accounts, we know it's concerned of Christians. But it doesn't actually say only Christians. And so some people gradually start thinking, well, can foreign usurers also be Jewish, and begin using it in that way. And so we suddenly find this canon law being invoked and used in various places all over Latin Christendom, in Germany and Italy, as far as sort of Portugal. Again, different communities who can be framed as being engaged in quote-unquote sort of usurious money lending, which is, any money lending the Catholic Church forbids, which is in fact any money lending of any interest whatsoever. Modern usury, of course, is excessive interest in the eyes of Catholic theologians. Any interest is usurious.
And I'm curious now the whole book deals with institutional innovation, and one of the things that you do very well is describing how complicated this was, if you think about the state or the church as a sort of bureaucracy, right? How did it work, right? So how there were the release of these broad guides, but how were they implemented? And what do you think that says about state capacity or something in the Middle Ages? That it's something that we're talking every day. This is more about, right? The origins of European states back in the Middle Ages science, and we'll add next year's work on that. So I wanted to hear about that.
So I'll come at this question from two angles. One is the Weber. Actually, they do both Weber in a sense. I mean, it's hard to talk about, the origins of the state without somehow having Weberian angles. But I want to bring up the other Weber side, which is on the usury doctrine, where, of course, he famously argues in more subtle ways, I'm going to put it, but basically that usury ends up sort of distorting somewhat the possibilities, the church's usury doctrine, and to somewhat distorting the possibilities of economic development in Catholic sort of circles, and certain aspects of Protestantism that are freed from some of those concerns, combined with the Protestant ethic, lead to the origins of capitalism. That was part of the question of kind of why doesn't this develop out of sort of the banking houses of Renaissance Florence? Why did it develop elsewhere? And one of the problems of all work since Weber on medieval usury is it is assumed that the Catholic Church was actively enforcing this prohibition. So there's sort of this default assumption that the institutionalized church, because we have theological treatises about this, because we have laws about this, that the church is actually investing resources in actually enforcing this. And the problem, of course, is that most of the enforcement that would be happening takes place in the confessional, which is under sort of the seal of secrecy. Priests are supposed to reveal on various penalties what goes on in confession. So, probably lots of priests are in fact asking their parishioners, have you license interest? Are you guilty of usury? And then making them do penance. But there's a difference between, priests following through the confessional and sort of sustained institutional campaign against it. And one of the things that shocked me when I was doing the research for this book was that, here you have a sanction against usurers that is very public. Expulsion, unlike confession, leaves traces, is noticed, produces sort of a need for people to move. It is physical, it is public. And then very, very, very few bishops decide to enforce this. And I get into a lot of reasons why this is. In some cases, it's because they're indebted to the moneylenders, and they don't want to get rid of them. In some cases, it's because they just don't care. They just have other political battles they want to fight, and they don't want to get into this. In some cases, they clearly just didn't know. And much what I try to show in the book is how uneven the dissemination of knowledge is. That sort of, a lot of authorities, probably many bishops, certainly below that level, had no idea about this new law because the actual patterns of knowledge transfer are so weak. And so a lot of what I was doing in this book was trying to actually look at silences and sort of gaps in areas, which meant, not just looking for areas where we do find the law, but all the areas that we don't. And one of the challenges we have of writing medieval history and trying to do sort of broad generalizations from it is that we tend to focus on, the hits, as it were. Okay, I've searched a thing and I found a reference to the thing I'm looking for. And then we generalize from that. We don't look at, okay, out of all of the treatises written on medieval commercial ethics, out of all the treatises written on confession, out of all the laws passed by all the bishops in Europe, how many don't bother to mention this? And in fact, it's that sort of that null finding that is really useful for actually trying to generalize. The generalization is, in fact, most people didn't spend much effort trying to enforce this law, which very much goes against sort of the implicit Weberian claim that it undergirded a lot of work trying to explain the impact of usury doctrine. Then there's the question of state capacity, another Weberian theme. And it's easy to underestimate state capacity in the Middle Ages. Just to give one example, when Philip the Fair decides that he wants to expel all the Jews in his kingdom, medieval France is smaller than modern France, but it's still a pretty big place. There are somewhere between 60 to 100,000 Jews living within the boundaries of his sort of direct royal power in medieval France. And over the course of 3 days, royal agents, in total cover of secrecy, managed to fan out across the kingdom and arrest all the Jews living in the kingdom. And then basically hold them in jail, ransack their homes, and then drive them from the realm. So that's meant that sort of, it takes, can take a week, 2 weeks to get, from northern France to southern France. all this information had to be sort of sent out in secret, communicated to local officials so that nobody knew what was happening. All of them could be captured by surprise, which is a pretty impressive demonstration of state capacity in like 1306. Now, that's a high point. I mean, this is, the most sort of powerful king up to that point with the most sort of highly developed sort of organizational structure. But it still gives some sense of what a medieval state was capable of when the full institutional structure is mustered. So we certainly see that with a number of instances of expulsions of Christians as well, where there will be mass roundups of foreigners who will all be sort of hauled off and held in jail. And it doesn't always work. We have some evidence that sort of being sent to officers by the king saying, basically last time word got out and some of them hid. So, this time, keep your mouth shut sort of thing. But it still gives some sense of the possibilities of state to kind of launch these sort of large operations to identify, arrest, and then expel foreign communities.
It's fascinating that, what you're describing is in a certain way a true paradox, right? Like an environment where information transmission is very limited, but at the same time where there's certain circumstances you can this type of complicated endeavors, and they're feasible, and probably both things are true, partly because it's a small scale environment where people know each other, then probably information is very hard to travel across towns, but maybe within towns everyone knows about everything.
I think it's also important, there's a tendency to assume that if something gets a lot of rhetorical weight, that it is backed by a lot of sort of institutional weight. And I think we need to be very careful about assuming that those things go together. But I think that has blinkered a lot of the way that we tackle these particular problems, is sort of, we see there's lots of words about this. There's lots of sort of, interest in this, but not actually saying, well, did that actually translate to effective action on the ground? Where sometimes things that are in fact are not being talked about might in fact generate a much more systematic state effort, which is sort of goes against the sorts of historical research approaches we might have.
Let me ask you more about that. And I'm curious, at two levels here. So one is how you managed to get the type of evidence required to see things on the ground that many of those things result from what you describe as absence of information, right? So we don't see things happening. How do you observe them, and how are you able to articulate that that's persuasive evidence of something? But also, I would like to hear how you think about this from a super meta level, and how we build history, right? Because I share completely with you this general impression that, of course, your area of expertise of medieval Europe, but even in the history of 20th century Latin America or something like that, there's these truths that become as such because they were written somewhere and they popularized, and it was easy to catch them, to perceive them, to read them just because they were written out there. But whoever has good practical knowledge of the context can easily argue that those things are not accurate, right? So my general perception is that all of those of us who are interested in history, not only historians, but the rest of us in the social sciences, although sometimes it's don't recognize that leave the take job, we are indeed very focused on this very visible signals of things that are probably not fairly representative of the things on the ground. How do you think about that broader issue from the, an epistemological point of view or something?
So, I think that certainly, even the parts of the book that aren't focused on economic history per se, that my sort of initial formation as a social scientist comes through, certainly in the way that I approach sort of data collection. I like to think it comes through in that we live, for those of us who are medievalists, there's going to be huge gaps in source survival. We're going to be competing with that. But my thought is, let me gather everything And then I can also not just look for sort of absolute references to something, but I can sort of check that in sort of, relative frequencies. Is this sort of more or less sort of common to something else? I can sort of find proxy evidence. Perhaps I don't have something, I may have something else. So, for instance, this question of absences, it's really hard to make arguments from silence. And yet, in fact, if you have, perfect data, you can. If you've got sort of perfect, wonderful data, you can be like, this doesn't appear, and I can explain it this way. The challenge goes in the medieval context, if we don't have that, how do we still make these arguments? But to me, it's still important to be able to make the question, just how can we do it responsibly? And so, I track down, every single gospel commentary on the cleansing of the temple, which is a case in which Jesus cleanses the temple of the money changers who are there, thinking this is kind of a natural locus to talk about the expulsion of people who are guilty of usury. And I did that in sermons, I did that in gospel commentaries, I did it in sort of theological exegesis, so that I can track region by region, century by century, decade by decade, religious order by religious order, where are the communities that are talking about this versus not talking about this, and try to sort of get a granular level. And suddenly the topography of interest in sort of my particular law or this particular claim about expulsion ends up looking very different than one might see if one just, counted the number of references that one has total and didn't actually sort of think of all the things that are out there which we don't have that. That takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. It's not something that most scholars of the past have the luxury of doing. I was very lucky that I was an institution, for my PhD and my postdoc and then now, where I essentially had the luxury of time to go and be that systematic. But the pressures of, on the historical side, that you have to gather evidence and publish something, means that most people don't have the time to gather that sort of broad-ranging evidence. And on the social science side, no one has the time for that, which means one sticks with the evidence that's already been gathered and is reasonably digested, and then one can begin sort of, conceivably cleaning and processing for questions. So I think it is a challenge that in neither sort of history departments and history programs sort of per se, or in social life, is there a lot of room for the kind of really boring, slow data gathering that allows us to actually sort of figure out the complexities of sort of pre-modern societies. And I think that is a challenge that when we talk to each other or what questions we ask, that social scientists are necessarily going to be more interested in asking the questions which data has already been produced. And historians are going to never generate the sort of data sets that the other social scientists can use, because it's way easier to just hone in on the instance that we found and spit out this local context than keep on looking for more and more and more. I looked through 2,500 sets of synodal statutes, all of which ends up being 2 paragraphs in the book. That's, more than a year of my life getting boiled down to 2 paragraphs. I'm proud of those 2 paragraphs. But it's not something that anything in the historical profession would ever think is sort of justified in terms of the resources. And it's only my special formation as a, social science at the beginning was like, I can't make a claim about any of this until I have looked at all of this evidence. So I do think there is a challenge there in terms of disciplinary conversations, disciplinary methods, and disciplinary priorities about how one does more like this work. I'm not sure I could ever write another book like this. Maybe, I'm tenure now, so maybe that's I'll tackle something like this, but it's not something that emerges naturally out of the disciplinary priorities.
Are there economies of scale in your life? So you wrote 2 paragraphs. Are you planning to use those sources for something else? Do you have them on your...
So I was really glad I did eventually turn that, partly because I gathered so much of information, I was going to do some of it, but I did turn it into an article, and I was really happy, in fact, that Amish Malbabusik, who was here at Stanford, then ended up using that article in a couple of interesting ways in her recent book, and she and I are now working on a collaborative project that does make some use of that. And so part of it was realizing about halfway through the data collection that if I was doing all this, and only a little part of it was going to answer my question, I'd better structure this in a way that could in fact be useful for other scholars. So, I have tried really hard to take everything I gathered and from the midpoint onward, and then work effectively, actually turn that into a usable data set that is publicly available online that scholars can use that is now out there. But that was not something that in my own formation was ever talked about as a goal or a positive outcome, that, while you are gathering your data, you should gather in a systematic way that can be used by somebody else. That's not the way that we talked about it in history programs. And so, again, I was grateful that I was even aware that there is a world in which people gather data and then share their clean data of other things. That, I think, is one of the reasons that historians and social scientists should be talking to each other more often, so that when historians do this kind of boring legwork, it doesn't just get lost in our own files, but is structured in ways that are legible to those other questions. But those conversations just do not happen enough. They're happening a bit more in Europe because of public funding for projects, but even there, very rare for an individual scholar working their own project to end up making all that data available publicly. There's such a desire to kind of hold on to it for oneself. And then, because of the precarities of the job market, things end up on somebody's laptop and never go anywhere. Someone doesn't end up having institutional affiliation to kind of put in a repository or continue to finish the project and get 10% of the way and then drop it. I think that's a huge problem, and it's really unfortunate. So that's why I would love to see more early conversations between social scientists saying, this project you're doing is really exciting, and 8 years from now, when you finish this, can you make sure that you gathered this in a way that we can do cool things with it? But nobody, when I was starting, had that conversation with me. So I was lucky that I was going to enough economic history seminars that I could see, there's a different world over there.
It's actually quite surprising how infrequent our co-author works in history, isn't it, compared with, the social science in general is not huge compared with, biology.
Right. But like inherited with, the classic history profession, all the other social sciences are doing so much better, and it is so strikingly rare. And it's one nice thing about this shift to archaeology is that now it's in those areas of medieval and obviously ancient history, very common because archaeology is clearly a collaborative discipline. But outside of that, it still shocks me how much this remains a solitary task and endeavor, and then proprietary. And how these things, I have them.
Let me add to one final thing about, it's probably more related to your recent agenda, but it's connected with something that I felt while reading the book, which is that you seem very interested in, and probably that's what you're working on now with data, on policy. I'm using here econ language, right? So policy innovation, policy adoption. And there's something that is fascinating that results from reading your book, and is this general sense of many people don't know what they're doing. So policy implementation, there's a good fraction which is that, I'm here, I need to do something, and what should I do? Well, I'm going to apply just the common sense that I have, and I'm going to interpret things in a certain way. And I think that that's something that even in modern context is very common. And I always think about, in one of my classes, I talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. And the big story, that is the popular one about the fall of the Berlin Wall, is how Confucian. There's this politician describing how they're going to manage the situation. He just doesn't know very well what to say, and he provides the wrong message, and everyone understands, okay, the wall is falling tomorrow, whatever. And whoever who has had some exposure to the public sector would probably describe that as their daily life. However, the way in which we frequently think about how the public sector operates from policy science and econ doesn't look like that. We describe a state that is much better organized with clear rationalities and so on. How do you think about that? What do you see in your context, and how are you planning to expand on that? If that's actually, again, it feels to me that that's something you're particularly interested in.
So, as you picked up, I spent a lot of time trying to sort of connect the dots and say, the language here of this expulsion order mirrors that expulsion order. And you actually can see that so-and-so had trained here and then sort of moved back here and brought a manuscript with him that actually sort of invoked that. So trying to connect those dots was a lot of the work that I was trying to do to see, what are the pathways by which mass expulsion ideas and expulsion spread. And it was actually interesting. And the original subtitle for this book was on the rise of mass expulsion. I was interested in sort of its increasing frequency. And then by the time I finished writing the book and doing the revisions, I realized that actually I wasn't so much interested in kind of quantitative rise. I was interested in sort of geographic and institutional spread. How does this idea come to permeate multiple different kinds of institutions, secular and ecclesiastical? How does it spread out of England and France into other parts of Europe where the underlying concerns were different? We're not sort of activating it. And so, the policy transfer literature and the innovation literature was really helpful. But what I found is most of it was not well suited to explain the sheer messiness, as you basically picked up on, that I was finding in my historical sources, where, it was really hard to figure out why somebody who had all the conditions in place that they should have, in fact, seized on this innovation and made use of it, doesn't. And then somebody in a random place sort of does. So there's a certain sort of, stochastic sort of element here where, history just gets messy. And here, at least, as I, did more work, I came to be really influenced by, Mark Granovetter's work on threshold models of collective behavior, which, he developed for a totally different set of questions. But the idea of thresholds in general came to be useful to me, thinking, okay, what are the conditions that make a certain outcome more likely or less likely? I can never explain, and I try in the book to sort of argue that we shouldn't try to explain any given expulsion of any community as caused by, this particular thing or even this particular context, because I can show in a few instances in incredible granular detail that in this town is because one basically priest came back from studying law in a different place when he'd miscopied a particular phrase in a manuscript, and then could go back and tell his cousin, who was then the bishop, that he should expel Jews because the church ordered him to do so. And all this is actually just based on, a miscopying of one manuscript of one person. We can almost never get to that granular level of detail with historical archival research, especially to the period I'm working on, but even in more recent periods. But we can ask questions about, okay, when you have a text that lends itself to certain kinds of ambiguities and it gets institutionalized in these channels or those channels, how does that shift the thresholds? And I think that is, again, it's probably my initial formation as a scientist coming and pushing back against my historian's training, where as a historian, I was thinking, I want to get to the roots here, the causes. And as I did it, I started to think, most of the time I can't get there, but I can ask under what conditions, the classic social scientific question. And that, I think, is something that I hope my book has started, helps other people in my field interested in these topics think about more. It's certainly got me thinking more about this, and rather than asking about causes, instead of asking about conditions.
Let me ask you one final question, sort of closing that broad scheme about how the field evolves and the challenges that it faces, is what can we do about it, right? So now that you have a position of power, right, as the head of the Center for Medieval Studies and early modern studies, what do you think that it's possible to do from an institutional point of view? I know that, so you're inserted in a broader context in which the forces are very strong, but what type of initiatives are worth pursuing? Where do you think that there's sort of high impact for helping to build a community that is more robust, more open to question methods, that basically goes in the right direction? How do you approach that responsibility?
That's a big one. There are little things I can do in an institutional role, like when I'm running CMIM. So, for instance, next year, the symposium we're going to organize is in honor of the 75th anniversary of the publication of Denon Fladel's Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in Aegisthus II, which was a monumentally influential book published in the 20th century, 1949. It comes out that brought together historical geography, economic history, diplomatic history, environmental history. It sort of found some of these fields as distinct categories, and was a huge influential work that remains read in a number of different fields, precisely because it was so intellectually generative. And my thought is, okay, if I can gather together a community of people who all are animated and inspired by the level of interdisciplinary conversation that book represented, which was, profoundly innovative in when it was published, can we then use that as a springboard to think about, okay, what are the other disciplinary conversations that aren't happening now, but that if they were happening might have similar impact? And so, in my field, we're all well aware of the disciplines that tend to talk to each other. So, history talks a lot with literature, religious studies, and other humanistic fields. We, in fact, don't talk nearly as often with, geography, let alone other social sciences. And it seems to me that, hopefully using a book that did models extraordinary results of wide reading and interdisciplinary conversation might encourage those sorts of conversations to happen. So one thing is just, what events you have and who you bring together. And there's also, I think, encouraging trends on the quantitative side, in that, one of the great advantages of the AI jump is that it's actually making it a lot easier to do a lot of the sorts of complicated analyses that would have scared off sort of historians and others to begin with. It's a lot. You could have ChatGPT write your code for you. Now, again, you probably want somebody to look at it and make sure it's not spouting nonsense. But some of the barriers to entry for someone who's interested in this are, in fact, getting much, much lower. So, it's going to be very possible to, take my undergraduate students very soon, give them, my 3 million word corpus of medieval Latin texts about sort of, local legislation, and not worry about that it's in Latin, because AI is going to be able to handle that. And they're going to be able to come up with questions that they have with this corpus, even without knowing Latin, and then sort of get answers to that. So I'm excited about the ways that some of these transformations will make the sorts of, technically very difficult things that may have sort of varied in the past, in fact, much lower, and encourage students to just ask the questions they find interesting and know that the methods are there and accessible. That I think is one of our great best hope in some ways for those of us interested in, these sorts of questions in the past.
Well, thank you. Let me thank you. It was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you.
Figure out all the problems, man.
You solved all the problems.
I appreciate it. I'm seeing you soon, probably.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.